So people stake on Ethereum so that they become like part of a network security, like they become validators, and that gives them duties of following the chain, making votes, coming to consensus on the state of the chain, etc. You often hear that Ethereum has 1 million validators, and that's like a very flashy number, but actually it's kind of a fake number to some extent. Like it doesn't mean there's 1,000 people who individually, like each one runs a node and like comes to that consensus. In practice, there's much fewer nodes that are participating in that. But the fact that we have 1 million validator means that we have 1 million votes that are disseminated on the network, and that's like a lot of weight, a lot of bandwidth, a lot of work to like aggregate them together.
Brad and I today are going to be talking with Barnabé Monnot, who is the co-lead of research at the Ethereum Foundation. And we are hoping to learn about the most recent activity in the Ethereum ecosystem, specifically the upgrade recently, the Pectra upgrade. By recently, I mean a few months ago, but for academics, that's recent. And also perhaps the upcoming upgrade, Fusaka. But before we dive into the details of either of those upgrades, I'd like to maybe take a step back for those who might not be familiar with, let's say, the cycle of upgrades for Ethereum, might not be familiar with what's called the scaling roadmap. And Barnabé, I was hoping that maybe we could kick it off with you kind of giving sort of that 30,000-foot view of how, let's say, the cycle of upgrades happen in Ethereum currently, and what the scaling roadmap means and how it relates to these upgrades.
Yeah, sounds good. So I think until the merge, which was like the move from proof of work to proof of stake, there was like always this one objective of, oh, we have to change our consensus mechanism, move to proof of stake, etc. That happened September 2022. After that, I think it was much less clear, like what is the big thing that Ethereum is going towards. The way upgrades work in Ethereum is we do these hard forks, which is like where we introduce all of these features and the network has to opt in to like using them. That happens fairly infrequently, like every year so far. And I would say over the last 2-3 years since the merge, like, yeah, we've shipped like some pretty big things. So like Blobs for rollups, we shipped withdrawals for stakers and stuff like that. But I don't think it was like super clear, like, oh, is there like a one single direction that the Ethereum network is heading towards? I think we still don't necessarily have one single direction, but at least we've been a bit louder and a bit clearer in saying we have these kind of strategic priorities that we should really try to make the hard forks about. And one of them, as you said, is the scaling roadmap. So we really want to take the Ethereum mainnet to host as much activity as possible. We want the network extensions that are rollups to have as much capacity as possible as well. So we really want like as much scale for the network so that we have the cheapest fees and the most users on Ethereum.
Can you tell me what the dimensions of scaling are? Like what are the things you can do to what are the impacts you have by scaling?
Yeah, so the main proxy I would say is gas. So gas is like a measure of complexity of interactions on chain. So when users want to send money, do swaps, use vaults or lending markets or anything, like they have to send this transaction, and the transaction like does something. Like the machines that run the Ethereum protocol have to update their internal databases, have to do some compute, etc. And so scaling means trying to get as much juice as possible out of these machines without necessarily like imposing significant costs on the people who run these nodes. So we always try to get the Ethereum network to be as light as possible to run so that many people around the world can verify it, can make sure that what is coming to consensus on is actually like valid. So we want the network to be fairly light to run, but at the same time we really do want to get as much activity as possible. So it sounds like we're trying to like square the circle, but some of the means include like trying to be smarter about how we schedule work on these machines. So like make better use of the resources that are available and not like have more waste or overhead in the system. And another thing is just like introduce let's say cryptographic improvements. So one of the main arcs that we are on at the moment is integrating the ZK and SNARKs technology to ensure that it's very easy to convince yourself that computation was run honestly on the Ethereum network without having to run everything yourself again. And so integrating these asymmetric technologies gives us like a ton of scale, and that's really what we're heading towards these days.
So if I can back up a bit, because you mentioned different priorities in addition to scaling. Could you clarify what are the priorities going forward?
Yeah, so at the moment we have three stated priorities, which I would say are more like short term to medium term. So it's possible that they get revisited in the next years, but for now, like that's what we are have our eyes on. So scaling the L1, that's one priority. Like so, more juice on the execution layer of Ethereum. Scaling L2s, so having more blobs, which is what L2s use to scale themselves. And the third one is improving UX and interoperability. So making sure that it's more seamless to use Ethereum as it becomes not just like the L1, but like this network of chains. And so you have all of these cross-chain interactions. And so at the moment, like these are three things where, yeah, we're trying to put a lot of our own resources on, and also, yeah, advocating for in terms of this is the stuff that we need to get into these hard forks moving forward.
I see. And so actually, it occurs to me that, of course, you all did a reorganization of the Ethereum Foundation organization recently. And, so one question always is like, okay, so you have these three priorities, but to what extent are they more than just things that the Ethereum Foundation is saying and things that have sort of versus things that are, you've sort of put the structure in place to achieve it. So could you talk maybe a little bit about sort of the reorganization of, let's say, the org chart of the Ethereum Foundation in order to achieve success on these priorities, and maybe you can reference, protocol the as part of that reorganization.
Maybe
Yeah.
as you answer that question, you can also, I'll throw in one. It's like, how are these priorities decided?
Yeah, that's a good question. So it's always been like very decentralized, like the cycle of governance of the Ethereum network to decide like what do we do next. So we obviously have like strong voices, strong institutions like the Ethereum Foundations that have their own opinions, or core devs, etc. But yeah, I would say the way that these priorities were decided, or at least taken to be like, okay, these are the three things that we are kind of enshrining at the moment, like for our attention. I think of it as like really a conversation with the community that has been fairly loudly over 2024 saying that, yeah, it cannot continue like this. Like we have to be a bit stronger in terms of stating what we want, in terms of like putting means behind the things that we want to achieve. Like revisit like why is Ethereum seemingly like potentially losing ground against other chains, other networks that are improving themselves. So it took a while, I think, to crystallize like around these three things, and they're not exhaustive. Like there's plenty of other things that are really important to the network and that continue to be like worked on, like security, basic network security. I think that's still something that we spend a lot of time on. But the idea of saying, well, these are now these three things that we think are important, like from the Ethereum Foundation's perspective, that also reflects like the will of the community, and to some extent also, in my opinion, the will of core developers who we've talked to. Like once we've said scaling is very important, I think a lot of people were also saying, yeah, we also believe that we need to scale, and this is really like the direction that people have been moving toward. So that's maybe the context of this reorganization. Like it's not really we reorganize, say, okay, now these are the goals, and we roll them out like to the network. I would say, in fact, it's backwards. So it's more like we've seen that these goals have kind of emerged, and we really wanted to be able to be in a position where we can deliver as successfully as possible behind them. And one of the objectives of this reorganization is, one thing is the Ethereum Foundation is like a very interesting place to work in. for a long time, like it's been this collection of teams which had like a high level of autonomy, sometimes like very loosely connected with one another, like each team having kind of its own domain. And one thing that we realize is as the network becomes like more complex and as we want to ship more ambitious things, like we really need to have much more stronger internal cohesion and make use of the opportunity of like having all of these smart people both on the research side but also on the development side, and put them all together like behind the same like fairly clear set of priorities. So yeah, we're trying to thread the needle between keeping this autonomy that we all love. Like I think we're all fairly high agency people who like to be very driven like behind what we do, and also like deliver on things that are much more concrete and measurable than perhaps like we were used to before.
But so how did the reorganization help you like ensure that cohesion? I mean, could you talk a little bit about what the actual reorganization was from the perspective of the organizational chart and such?
Yeah. Yeah, first there's been like in fact several reorganization at the Ethereum Foundation. So the first one was as leadership. So there were new like co-executive directors that were named in March, Shawei and Tomasz. So that was like I would say the first thing. In early June, the research and development teams that are working on the protocol, we were formerly known as Protocol R&D, did their reorganization. So that's the one that I've been a part of. And as part of this reorganization, like one thing that happened is, for instance, we used to have a group of teams that was called EF Research that I was co-leading with Alex Stokes. And in this reorganization, we said, well, this boundary between like what research is and what's not research is not really helpful, because we really need to have like more alignment, like not be the researchers are thinking about these very far away goals and the developers are working on like the day-to-day stuff. Like we need to be much more like tightly integrated. Like the research needs to feed into scaling proposals that are going to come out like next month, next year, etc. So yeah, this boundary disappearing is just one concrete, let's say, org chart change. Then there was like a couple of team changes. We have a new team, for instance, that's prototyping. So really like working on making sure that we can move the research to production like as quickly as possible. We have a team that's ZKVM that's just like dedicated to the research engineering of shipping a ZKVM. Yeah, and we've also just like made sure that we are well staffed in terms of network security, network testing. Like how can we get the forks to happen like as fast as possible, essentially. So yeah, it's fairly like administrative changes to some extent, but I think it's also like created a little bit of momentum that's been nice.
I see. So then with that background in place, maybe let's pivot to Pectra, right? So if I understand correctly, that's the most recent upgrade, which was it in May? Okay.
7 May. Yeah.
Okay. Now, if I remember correctly, there were a number of things in this particular upgrade. So I guess first and foremost, how much was actually in this upgrade, and then maybe we can get into some of the bigger pieces of it.
Yeah, it was a fairly big upgrade, and the process to get there was also like quite sinuous, like with many changes, and something wanted to be shipped first, and then the fork like scope split. And anyway, it was kind of like one of the, I think it was actually the biggest upgrade in terms of just like raw number of proposals that were included in it, and it touches like many different parts. So it touches the UX, like there's a feature in there, 7702, that is very driven towards like making accounts like smarter and more usable for users. There are features that are aimed at scaling, so there is doubling of the blob throughput, so that rollups have more capacity to post blobs on the mainnet. There are features that are for stakers, so max EB, consolidating the stake. So it really like touches like many different parts of the stack and many different like stakeholder groups at once.
So maybe if we could kind of go through some of them, and maybe even it's useful to think about them through the lens of the three priorities that you described. So you started by referencing something that you described as being for the user interface, the smart contract upgradability. So could you maybe clarify in more depth? So first of all, mechanically, what is this, right? So I guess we have externally owned accounts and smart contract accounts on Ethereum that we're used to having there for years and years. So what's the change as a let's say traditional user who has an externally owned account? What can I now do owing to this particular aspect of the upgrade?
Yeah. So as you said, you had like these two accounts, externally owned, which means I have my private key, I sign things, and I can originate transactions from that account. And you have smart contract accounts, which cannot originate transactions, but can be fully programmable. And so they have like a lot more extensibility in a way. So EIP 7702 is the ability to delegate functionality of an externally owned account to a smart contract. So in a sense, like you're making an externally owned account, which is kind of dumb, behave as if it was a smart contract, and that unlocks like many different features. So one of them, for instance, very simply, is on Uniswap. If you want to swap a token that you didn't interact with before, you have to approve the use of the token first, and then you have to like swap it. So from your externally owned account, you would have to sign like 2 messages on your wallet. When you delegate functionality to a smart contract account, what you can do is batch this transaction. So you only need to sign 1 transaction to execute like these 2 actions in a sequence. So that's a UX improvement where you only need to do 1 signature instead of 2, essentially. Other types of things that you can do with them is it's a bit easier to do like what is called as gas sponsorship. So whenever like you do an action on the network, you have to pay for it. Like that's spam resistance. But if your wallet is not funded, or if the app wants to sponsor the interaction of your account with the app itself, like that's a bit tricky. Like it's not so straightforward to do it with just like the externally owned account. But going through that smart contract that you delegate your account to, somebody can come in and sponsor your transaction. So like pay for the gas in your stead. And so these are the types of like functions that these accounts allow you to do.
So
But
just if you don't mind, if I just want to briefly distinguish. So I think this is implicit, probably what you're saying, but I want to clarify my understanding here. I want to distinguish state from code. And what I mean by that is, so people might have a mental model of something like, in order to do this, I have to like write my own smart contract that's customized for whatever I want to do, and then sort of like I attach myself to it. And even if somebody wants to do something very similar, they got to kind of do their own, because like when I think about a traditional smart contract, it has a state, at least without like upgradability and so on, like the very simplest sort of style smart contract, it has a state, and like 2 ERC20 tokens have different state variables for balances and so on, right? So like there's lots and lots of, for instance, contracts on Ethereum that are basically the same structure of ERC20. But in this case, if I understood what you were saying correctly, that's not true, right? So essentially, like there is a smart contract code that essentially I'm attaching to my externally owned account, and so I can basically call functions. But the state variables in that code are not like global state variables, as in there. So for instance, I or Brad could be using the same smart contract for essentially to upgrade our externally owned accounts, and we'd be calling. So we're calling essentially the same code, but we have different states at different points in time. Is that, or maybe you could clarify how that works exactly?
Right. So indeed, like you can both have the same smart contract that you delegate to, because what you do in your externally owned account is you just set a pointer to like an address where the contract is. Most of the interactions that I think happen through 7702 are stateless. So in a sense, like you're not creating new state like in the smart contract that you're delegating to. Like it's almost like a piece of code that just describes like the interaction, and you go through it and no state gets created. Like it's just allowing you to batch things, to get somebody to sponsor transactions. Like it's passed through and there's nothing that gets written. If it did get written, it would just be written in the smart contract state, and you would not need to necessarily distinguish between Brad state or Fahad state, like the same way that an ERC20 contract is just a registry of which addresses like hold how many tokens, like a basic mapping. Yeah.
There's one UX part that I think is a big improvement, and maybe you can explain better than me. It's like the idea that I don't need to keep a seed phrase anymore. Like this can be managed by the smart contract somehow. Can you explain this? Like, I hate having to pull out my ledger and sign and like, sign things, and this is a upgrade to that. So can you describe
Yeah.
how this enhances that?
Yeah. So in a way, since the externally owned account like delegates to a contract, there is still like a private key somewhere that controls the externally owned account. And in fact, the externally owned account can still revoke the delegation at any point. So you might still have like a seed phrase that you want to keep so that you have access to this. But once you delegate functionality to this smart contract account, what you can do is have the smart contract account authentify the interactions that happen on chain for you. So you can use, for instance, something like passkey, which is a different way of signing than like using the ECBSA private key. You can have, as part of a smart contract account functionality, something like social recovery, where you have some kind of multi-sig that allows to recover like the contract itself. And so indeed, like from the perspective of a user, let's say in the background, some EOA is created for them, and that EOA deploys like a delegated smart contract. The user, in a sense, doesn't need to necessarily worry about the EOA itself, and all of its interaction with like its account can go through the smart contract and can go through these better UX functionalities of having the ability to use different types of authentications.
And this is still as safe as keeping my private key for myself. Like, do I have to worry about exposing it?
I think as long as the smart contract you're delegated to has been like sufficiently verified,
Mm-hmm.
that it's not something that has a backdoor or that can get bricked at any point in time. That's also why I think people are not yeah, not every single person who's using this makes up their own like delegated smart contract. Like there's a few reference implementation. One Uniswap has like a toolkit that they have open sourced to build like these types of things. MetaMask has its own implementation, etc. So as long as you use like things that have been audited, verified, I think you should feel fairly confident that you can recover like through the smart contract itself.
If you're a relatively naive user, how would you suggest judging whether something has been appropriately verified?
Right. I think you have to talk about like what category of user am I. So I think when I start like in crypto and maybe I'm choosing like a wallet, if that's even something that users do, because now often they just use the app and the app creates the wallet for them. So hopefully like the information is sufficiently mediated that if I come into a new app, maybe the wallet gets created for me. I can go in the docs and see what is the app using, like are they using like some components of the reference implementation. Um, I do rely to some extent on the app being probably honest with me and telling me what's behind it. Other than that, I do think there's like more literacy that will be required and more knowledge around like the state of wallets and everything. So like L2Bit, what they do like for rollups. Recently, the EF has given like a grant to something called WalletBit, which intends to do kind of the same thing, but for wallets. And so there you could see like, for instance, these are like all the parts that have been audited. Like a wallet is also many different things. Like it's not just this delegation to smart contracts, like it's a lot of other features. And so that could be like a bit of a sharing point for people to find information on, okay, if I want to make sure that the thing I'm using is like safe, I can go to this one place and I don't have to have like a custom behavior for every single thing that I use that's different. Yeah.
So I was thinking of asking you about kind of how one of those naive retail users I just alluded to might go about looking to find what are the types of smart contracts they would want to upgrade into, short of listening to the examples that you listed on this pod, but just sort of more an exhaustive way of trying to figure out like a dashboard of those sorts of things. But I sense you kind of answered it in the sense that like uh, as an economist, I guess one way I'd frame it is that I think you're highlighting the importance of intermediaries in the sense that I guess like for instance, if I'm using a particular wallet software, then maybe maybe there's a world in which the wallet software itself will provide me some kind of dashboard to get a sense of what are the potential smart contracts I could upgrade to, and therefore they could also then, not include ones that are not verified, and in some sense that provides me some level of protection. But I guess practically, I'm kind of wondering like how. So this is a bit of big picture thing, like how you see the future usage of these sorts of things, particularly from the perspective of a wider, more mainstream audience. Do you kind of envision it in the way of there will be essentially intermediaries, in this case, like say wallet providers, who are kind of doing some due diligence to put in front of users what is actually verified versus not?
Yeah, I think again, like putting the economist hat on as you do, there's an information cost to like figuring out like, okay, what am I using? Like, do I want to make sure that yeah, it's safe enough, it's private enough, etc. I think of it as a bit of like a pyramid, and at the tip of a pyramid, like you have a few users who have like very, very strong preference to only use things that have been like properly verified, open source, that are private, that will go into the code and inspect the stack. And I would say our best line of defense is to make sure that it's always possible for any single user to go and just like figure out all of these details. And these details must be available, and the user can be intermediary free, like write his own contract if they want, deploy the thing themselves if they want, etc. That's a bit of a boundary condition. Like it's not going to be the mainstream for 99.99% of the users who use them. But then I think it keeps the pyramid like honest. Like it's kind of difficult then for a bigger app to build on a thing that's like not verified, because some user will like raise the flag and say, okay, this looks like a bit fishy. And the bigger the app becomes, the more likely it is that there's one guy somewhere who's going to be like, okay, let me ask some questions and see whether like the app is really doing the thing that I think is right. So yeah, I think for instance, if Coinbase wanted to introduce something like this, and they did it like in a way that was very poor, like immediately people would be able to say, okay, this like doesn't pass the smell test. So that's kind of how I think of it. Like I think hopefully the fact that the information is available, even if it's costly to obtain, means that the system as a whole like is kept healthy, and there is always like the opportunity to exit if you figure out that something you use is broken.
Right. Okay. But so I guess one way of framing what you're saying then is that um, so even in the context that we're talking about intermediaries, we're not talking about it in the context of, let's say, TradFi, where kind of everything is inside of a particular firm and there's not the ability to, for instance, police what that firm is doing, right? Um,
Yeah.
so it's one thing to have an entity that is useful to retail investors as a way of checking or providing some uh, maybe signal that in the economic sense, a signal that that this contract may not have any backdoors or anything like that. But it's another thing to kind of somehow give an intermediary like a monopolistic position in the market, and that's not what we're talking about here. Everything is still on a public blockchain, and hopefully people will be looking into these sorts of things so that you are not going to have a particular smart contract be used widely, and then it turns out it's a scam and it drain wallets, because presumably somebody who's interacting with that smart contract is actually looking at the code and sort of
Right.
blowing the whistle. Um, just maybe one last question on 7022 or sorry, it was what's the
7702.
7702, yeah,
Yeah.
7702. How widely is this used at this point? Like just to give like a rough idea of maybe if you have any kind of economic magnitudes or anything like that.
That's a good question.
Yeah.
I checked, I think a month ago. I actually think like the Uniswap wallet at the time was the main vector of adoption. Like that was one of the the main places where users would come in, get an account created, and then be put onto 7702. I haven't checked since then, but I think it was fairly quick and looked pretty exponential. There is a website called Builder Bear, if I think. No,
Builder Bear?
uh, I could find it. Might need to. Bundle Bear, sorry.
Bundle Bear. Ah.
And you can see
Got
the Build-A-Bear is the place where you
yeah.
can make your own teddy bear. But yeah, Bundle Bear from Coffee, where you can see some of the metrics of EIP 7702 and the adoption of smart contract accounts.
Yeah, actually, and so Kofi is a good reference here. If for anybody who's interested, following him on Twitter is probably a good idea if you care about this particular aspect of the upgrade. So it's 0x Kofi is his handle, if anybody is interested. And Bundlebear is bundlebear.com, right? So
Mhm.
maybe to end that part of the conversation, there's some points of contact for people to learn more about 7702. But then maybe let's talk about other aspects of Pectra. So you also mentioned a piece that has to do with the scaling on layer 2, blobs. Could you talk a bit about that?
Yeah. So blobs, I think of it as like the raw material that the rollups need to purchase from Ethereum so that they can be rollups. So they are rollups because we can verify what happens on their networks, like they are separate chains. So they have their own state, they have their own transactions, their own users, but they report back like what's happening on the rollup, and anybody can either verify or challenge that indeed the execution on the rollup like happens properly. And when I say anyone in particular, I mean the Ethereum L1, which is kind of like the parent chain of these rollups. And so the way it works is, yeah, you have this hook that's through the blobs. So the rollups, they have some activity, pack the data into blobs, post the blobs on Ethereum, and then that data becomes available to the network. And so if we want L2s as a scaling solution for Ethereum, in a way, it's great because they compress this information. Like instead of the Ethereum network having to recompute everything that happens in the rollups, it can just like get the data, which is like much cheaper to do. But then we limit the rollups to the amount of data that the Ethereum network can support. Up until Pectra, we were targeting 3 blobs per block on average, and I think that led to about 7 or 8x multiplier on the L1 throughput to the rollups. After Pectra, we doubled that throughput, so we moved to like 6 blobs targeted on average on the network. So we're doubling the capacity for these rollup networks to grow.
So
Before the upgrade, were the 3 blobs per block a limitation? Like, were they being maxed out? Or
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, they were actually maxed out. Yeah, they
like,
were not maxed out like from the beginning, but
yeah.
they eventually were getting maxed out. And in particular, when there was something like exciting happening on one of the rollups, there could be like some congestion on the blob markets, and you would observe like gas price war, so that people could post their blobs on chain. So we were at a point where the capacity was stably used up.
So if we could just add a little bit of context, I mean, I know this is probably now old hat, but maybe let's kind of go back to the beginning of blobs in some sense, because you talked about targeting 3, and so I guess what I think about when you use that language is essentially something like EIP 1559, right? So if I understand correctly, that there is a different gas price being paid to post a blob relative to sort of the normal interactions with the Ethereum blockchain, right? And so when you say, for instance, that we were targeting 3, does that mean that there was a max capacity of 6 or?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So we have like this 1559 market for the regular gas of Ethereum L1, which is what gives you like a price as a user to enter the network. And with the introduction of blobs, what we had then is this multidimensional gas market. So we're able like, to separate the economic activities and say, yeah, these are 2 things that the Ethereum network does, and we can like price them independently. So it's also like more optimal. And yeah, until Petra, the target was 3 and the limit was 6, which means that the price would adjust, the price of a blob would adjust such that on average, like the network provisions 3 blobs per block. But at any given time, you can have up to 6 blobs in a block. And after Pectra, the target moved to 6, so was doubled, but the limit was only increased to 9 because there is like some kind of burst limit that we were not confident that we could go above 9. So we moved away from like that 50% slack in the controller.
So actually, there's sort of two strands of questions that are occurring to me. One is, so I've heard this distinction about like execution versus data, because sort of one question that maybe some that somebody might think of here is that what is the optionality, given that I want to do a particular interaction with the Ethereum blockchain, to do it in the normal way versus through blobs? And this maybe also relates to the idea that this actually was something to help to scale the L2s, right? In the sense that, so if I understand correctly, a rollup could actually just post the data outside of the blobs, right, in the normal way, but it's probably not economically cost effective, right? Because essentially what you've done is like you've created a special space where the other like execution stuff can't go there, right? So basically, I have, if I'm just doing data posting, I have optionality, right? And I suppose, putting my economist hat on again, uh, uh, you would in equilibrium, it should be the case that the fee in the blob market should be at least as low as the fee in the other market. Is that right?
Oh, wait.
Um,
I think there's one thing you're forgetting is that the data is not permanently stored in
Okay.
the blob
Oh,
area.
okay.
Yeah. So I think that
yeah.
could maybe Barnabé that might be useful to explain whatever answer you're gonna give to Fahad, like
Yeah,
why it
yeah.
might be cheaper.
No, that's you're right, Brad. Yeah. So the blobs, they are only kept by the nodes like a couple of weeks, just to make sure that the data is available and people have time to like sample it, etc. But if you were to post the data directly like on the like through a regular mainnet transaction, which is actually what rollups were doing before the blobs came online, like with
Mhm.
4844. Yeah, then that call data would stay in the history of the chain for longer.
But just to clarify, so the thing I was alluding to from the economic side is that, so if I'm posting and I don't, so in principle, if they're posting in the blob market, then they don't care about it being there in the long run anyway, because
Yeah,
they're doing that. But they have optionality, right? So in other words, they wouldn't, if the price in the blob market was higher, then they would choose not to, because they can post and yes, it'll be there forever. But as you were saying, they were doing this before anyway.
yeah,
And so the economic equilibrium point is that, like, well, if you go to that world, then nobody's posting, but then it's really cheap to post, and so therefore it should be cheaper in the blob market. But if I understood you correctly, were you saying like towards the maybe towards the start of this year and before the Pectra upgrade, they were actually getting very congested? So were we seeing like 6 blobs per block, and were we seeing then the gas fees from, or the gas price for blob posting getting close, or getting close to
to like
the other?
that
Yeah.
equilibrium point, let's say. I think
Yeah.
not. I think it was still relatively quite significantly lower than the equilibrium point. But that equilibrium point is something that also was theorized. There's a paper that Davide from EF, I think is one of the co-authors, that was pretty early in saying that, yeah, you might want to have this ability to switch between the blob market to like back to the cold data market if you wanted to save.
Yeah.
In practice, I don't know, like, would that happen? Like, that's more code to maintain. It's, you kind of don't want to have a problem in there. It's not something that maybe you use like so often. I think, yeah, in theory it's possible. Practically, I'm not really sure that rollups would actually do that unless it was, yeah, the blob market was 10x more pricey than the whole data market. Yeah.
Right. I guess this gets into a different topic, which we probably shouldn't explore too much, which is that the roll up also has the option of kind of waiting, and so then there's a question of like, well, what is the cost of them just waiting a lot of time to see the congestion alleviate and so on? It's not as though it's like you have to choose one of these two things, because then in theory you could have like this ratcheting it up until you finally get close. But it sounds like what you're
Right.
saying is these might even be like different orders of magnitude, and so yes, you might be fully congested and it may continue to ratchet up, but it's not really, it's not
Yeah.
really getting to the same level that it is on the for instance, execution transactions.
Yeah.
Um,
And you can
But
wait, but then transactions still pile up. So the more you wait, like the more data you have to post as well. But perhaps that allows you to optimize certain things still. Yeah.
yes, like you want to wait for some NFT craze to expire and then the thing.
Something like
But
that. Yeah.
so what about the first category there, right? So you said one of the three priorities is scaling the L1. And so was there anything in Pectra that went to that?
I think at the time of like Pectra scoping, like the priorities had not been like so clearly articulated. So I don't know that there was actually anything specifically. Just looking at the list, maybe like some things on the margin would have like some effect on. So for instance, one thing was the cost of call data was increased in Pectra. I think that was done so that you reduce the worst case of a transaction packing a lot of call data and just like hogging the resources available on the network to just like do call data. So you can think of like increasing the cost of one resource as just like decreasing the relative cost of every other resource, and perhaps that gives you a bit more scale depending on the distribution of the demand for these resources. But I don't think it was like, oh, this is like the way that we're going to scale the network. But one thing that's kind of interesting that we can do like outside of the hard fork schedule is we can increase the gas limit of the L1. So this is something that's technically validator controlled. So the validators, like, it's almost like a vote, like they can vote to increase the gas limit by a little bit every time they make a block. Generally speaking,
What do
like
you,
it's always
what do you
been
mean by gas emit?
gas limit.
Oh, gas limit. Got it. Okay, yeah.
Yeah. So generally speaking, like they follow the recommendations of core devs who know what is safe to like support. But yeah, after Pectra, since we had this in fact call data cost capping, we were able to say, okay, now we can move a gas limit like to 45 million instead of 36 million. So we achieved quite a bit more scale from having like capped that worst case on the network. So yeah, now we're
But if
looking into like more of these optimizations that we can do outside of the fork schedule so that we can keep like increasing the gas limit.
but if you increase the gas limit, how does that affect the sort of amount of compute, or like how good your validator needs to be? Oh yeah, because I
Yeah,
think that's part of making it more difficult for uh, to have simpler
to
a
maintain.
validator on a Raspberry Pi.
Yeah, exactly. So when the gas limits like are introduced, like one thing that's done is a lot of testing, like to ensure that nodes that have some sort of hardware, minimum like hardware can still like follow the chain and be comfortable with it.
Okay.
To some extent, like a lot of so yeah, I would say there's maybe like two things that are bottlenecks to like raising the gas limit. Like one of them is the burst resources. So if at any point in time, like I can't uh, execute the current block in the required amount of time, like before the next block comes, for instance. So these are the burst resources. The reason why the call data cost was like capped in Pectra was because you could be in a case where I can make a bigger block that takes too long on like a not very good bandwidth to propagate across the network. And so if I cap the bandwidth use, then I know that I'm not going to make blocks that are going to be like outside of the feasible zone in terms of these burst resources. The second bottleneck is more like long term resources. So something like state keeps growing over time. Like every time there's like more transactions that have new state, new accounts, new balances, etc. That creates like a larger and larger state that slows down the nodes of the network. And eventually like they might even just run out of space to host that state in. And so this is also why like we want to throttle the gas in a way that we don't want to, like we want the growth of these stock resources to like be compatible with just like being sustainable over time. And here I think we are still like fairly conservative, but probably there's a bit more confidence from the fact that if we do move quite quickly to this future with ZKVM, we're able to remove the state from many nodes that are still performing like a useful function for the network. So yeah, that's kind of the tension like with scaling.
So just to clarify a question, when you talk about adjusting the cost of call data, so is this like the gas schedule you're talking about, or
Yeah. Yeah. So the way gas is measured is you have these different resources like memory, compute, state, call data. There's like different types of things, and they all get like normalized to a single numeraire, which is gas. And so an addition is worth like a tenth of a byte that is written in call data is worth a hundredth of a byte that is written in storage and stuff like this. And so you try to measure with gas like just the relative heaviness of the use of a certain resource. And so yeah, so when you change like the gas schedule, like what you're doing essentially is like repricing resources with respect to one another. Like you're changing the vector of prices or the vector of metering of these resources.
and so just for the more, let's say, the more retail audience. Uh, this makes me think about like the yellow paper of Ethereum. Like lots of people are familiar, I think, at this point with the white paper, but it always seems to me the yellow paper is a bit more central in the sense that like gets updated too, right? Like I'm looking at it right now on
Yeah,
my other screen, Appendix G fee schedule. But it's not the initial one that Gavin Wood wrote, right? Like you all when you all do these things, you update the paper, and so we can see the revised values. I mean, you can see it in other
yeah,
places, but this is like one source document, I think, that ends up being very useful to understand what's going on. Is that fair?
yeah, yeah. So I guess the state of a yellow paper is like the current snapshot of how things are. And the state diffs of that yellow paper are basically like the EIPs that are offering like new mechanisms or repricings. So yeah, I think gas repricings don't happen like so often.
Mhm.
We actually have people working on a much more fundamental repricing for potentially Glamsterdam, which is yeah 2 hard forks away. And yeah, the reason is that a lot of contracts, a lot of tooling. Sometimes, like they have some assumptions around how much gas is being used by what operations, and so when you change things like that, you also then need to change. Like some smart contracts might want to be rewritten so that they take advantage of like the cheaper resources. Some infrastructure might need to be rebuilt, so you have to be like also yeah, you can't just like change it every 2 hours. Yeah.
Now, you talked a little bit about sort of the constraints as it pertains to scaling. Uh, there's been certainly a lot of discussion online from some of your colleagues in particular about like let's say the long run of what the scale of Ethereum and the layer two separately is going to be and so on. And there's some quite large numbers that are being thrown around. Now, a lot of that, of course, has to do with the ZKVM stuff, which I think is kind of like its own deep topic. So maybe let's set that to the side. More, let's say, near term. Um, uh, could you provide kind of more of a high level sense of what we can expect in terms of scaling changes? Like even what you described about sort of the gas limit going from 30 to 45. I mean, that's actually in some sense quite substantial if you think about it proportionally. And in fact, like on L2B, you can even see the transaction throughput of layer one seems to have also kind of gone up, about
Yeah.
50%. So like, yeah, from a very high level, I think more of like the retail audience. What are the things that, we should be paying attention to try to understand kind of the extent to which the bottlenecks are going to abate? And again, let's set the ZKVM stuff to the side because that seems like an order of magnitude
Yeah.
kind of change, and there's so much stuff in there that I think it's too hard to get into here. Um,
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. The thesis, I guess, is that we can get an order of magnitude or maybe even a bit more than that extra gas before we even get to like the ZKVM. And there's a couple of things. Also, shout out to Ansgar who had a talk at Frontiers a week ago, which is really nice and goes like into let's say, like the fundamentals of how we think about this. But so yeah, there's a couple of like strategies that we can deploy before we even get to like ZKVM. So one of them is, as we discussed, for instance, with cold data, is like capping the worst cases, because whenever you have like one resource that's like overly demanding on the nodes, the worst case block can be like very bad if it just uses only that resource. Like it can do very little things and make the network kind of bad. And so finding like these bottlenecks, I think that's one thing, and then repricing them down. More generally speaking, like the gas schedule was, as you said, like mostly fixed in the writing of the yellow paper, which was 10 years ago. So hardware has evolved, even our recommendations have evolved. And so having like proper benchmarking to say, okay, now an addition is this much, multiplication is this much, storage is this much, etc. Like that's something where we can get like a bit a proper like measurement of the actual hardware. And so that also gives you like optimization. And then there's a few more things that we can introduce, which are not just like playing with numbers and trying to make bigger things fit, but actually like introducing like new features. So one of them is block level access lists. So there is this ability today for transactions to declare which parts of the state they will touch, and so that can help, for instance, the nodes put in the cache some of the values, which makes them like more efficient. And with block level access lists, which is now scheduled for Glamsterdam, we require the block itself to declare every state access that is going to be part of its execution. And so that allows nodes to like front load every state access that the block is going to induce, and then execute fairly quickly. And so that's a thing where, for instance, if you have this information of which parts of the states are touched, you can use that information to parallelize the execution, because you know that you can schedule like transactions that don't touch the same state independently from one another. And so that's one way to just like get more juice out of the hardware that already exists. And yeah, there's a couple more things like this. Another one is continuing with this multidimensional gas, so adding more dimensions to separate them so that they can be more independent, and you can find points that are like more optimal in the provision. So these are all like things that, yeah, essentially don't change the hardware, but just like make better use of the resources and add like more structured information for the nodes to like schedule the work more intelligently.
So,
Oh, wait, sorry. Quick, as you said, splitting up gas. Can you give me an example of how you can split that up even more? Was this with memory and compute or like call data? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, for instance, yeah. So like
Okay.
storage, state accesses, that could be something you want to split. There's always a bit of a trade-off where the more you split like the gas, like the more transactions have to potentially like declare, oh, I want to pay this much for storage, this much for
Right.
blobs, this much for things. The US can get a bit tricky, but there's
Yeah.
been like recent proposals that aim to simplify this by aggregating the different resources, like the metering, and then offering like a single price. So that's work that's done by Maria from Rig and Davide.
Okay.
right. So in some sense, looking at it resource by resource is like considering a less constrained version of the problem. But I guess you're saying there's a
Yeah,
complexity that comes with that. And
yeah,
I think one thing that's very interesting about sort of listening to your answer there is that a lot of people in mainstream circles, I think, have completely the wrong view of the crypto community, certainly the Ethereum community, where they kind of think of, let's say, more the pure financial side. And I think listening to it's like very clear there's a very strong engineering intellectual bent in particularly in the Ethereum community. And so it's quite impressive, actually, frankly. And I think one of the things hopefully that the Ethereum Foundation, or at least participants in the Ethereum community, are able to do in these next few years is to better highlight the sort of intellectual aspects of the community and maybe shift the narrative a bit away from the current perception in mainstream circles to understanding the fact that you have a lot of really smart engineers who are kind of working at serious problems here. Whatever you think of crypto assets, like this type of stuff you were talking about right now, is actually sort of the type of stuff an academic can like
Yeah.
sink his teeth into. But okay, maybe if we can kind of pivot here to another piece of Pectra that I was hoping you could talk about a little bit, and I think you alluded to it, uh, uh, the max EV. Right. So could you talk a little bit about the 32 ETH is no longer the constraint, is it?
Right. Yeah, yeah. So that's an update that has to do with the staking layer. So people stake on Ethereum so that they become like part of the network security, like they become validators, and that gives them duties of following the chain, making votes, coming to consensus on the state of the chain, etc. You often hear that Ethereum has 1 million validators, and that's like a very flashy number, but actually it's a fake number to some extent. Like it doesn't mean there's 1,000 people who individually, like each one runs a node and like comes to that consensus. In practice, there's much fewer nodes that are participating in that. But the fact that we have 1 million validator means that we have 1 million votes that are disseminated on the network, and that's like a lot of weight, a lot of bandwidth, a lot of work to like aggregate them together. And so, for instance, if I want to become a validator, let's say before Pectra, I have to put up like 32 ETH to become a validator. So that activates like one validator. If I have 64 ETH and I want to have these 64 ETH in stake, what I would have to do is activate two validators. And so now I have one machine, but two keys, essentially one for each validator that controls like 32 ETH. If I have 10, I need to do that 10 times. If I have 100, I do that 100 times. And it's kind of idiotic because then I have like a single machine that emits like 100 messages and they're all the same because it's like the same entity that controls it. And so MaxDB is the ability to consolidate different validators into a single one. So if you have 100 different keys, you can put them all on the same key. And the limit with Pectra is 2048 ETH, so I can consolidate up to that amount. And yeah, that allows the network to be a bit lighter. That has also some positive features for validator. Like one of them is the compounding is a little smarter. So we used to dole out the rewards for validators who participate based on their effective balance, which was like increments of 1 ETH. If you move to like this consolidated validator, you can have like actual consolidation. So the rewards that you get, they're immediately put back into the stake and they become like productive capital for you, whereas before they were not. So yeah, it's voluntary, like people don't have to do it. And in fact, we've observed right after Pectra, people started consolidating, and then we had suddenly a big inflow of new keys. So the number of validators is higher now than it was at Pectra. But yeah, we're reaching out to node operators who control like many validators to try and get them to consolidate them so that the network load is a little smaller.
Wait, you said you got more validators? I thought this would lead to less validators.
It can in
There's
theory, but in practice, it can also go the other way. And currently, it has gone the
Okay.
other way. It's actually going down as of like last month. Like the level of stake is the same, but the
Yeah.
number of validator is going down, which is what we want to see. Yeah.
So
It.
I would argue that when the theory doesn't match the practice, it just means the theory is the wrong model. But I think part of what
Agreed.
Barnabé was saying is that there might have been this effect when they did the upgrade that people who were not staking decided to start staking.
Yeah.
So
It's a
I'm looking at
little
one of
odd.
well, so it gets to the constraints on their side. But actually, so I'm looking at one of the blockchain explorers, and I see an average balance of 33 ETH, which I guess is higher than in the past. But I guess there's still a lot of people who are in the old setting. But you also can see pretty clearly here this decline in active validators. I mean, not a huge decline, but anyway.
Does that
Uh,
have a consequence on security and slashing? So if one validator, has 100 ETH, is that like more? I
are
don't
the
know.
slashing
Like,
penalties the same?
yeah,
No,
that's a question.
yeah, they were reviewed. So one thing that people were saying against compounding was, yeah, if I compound like many validators, a single error can then become more costly. It's a bit like portfolio theory where, yeah, if you now you have like a single thing, like you've put all of your eggs in the same basket. And so the schedule of penalties was reviewed to like remove that effect or mitigate it at the very least. It's still, I would say, the case that if your validator is part of like a larger attack that produces a safety fault, so like 1/3 of the stake makes like a conflicting message and you're part of that 1/3, then your whole stake gets slashed. If it's below this 1/3 threshold, that's actually like there's an incremental thing. So if you are a single validator, for some reason, like your node goes bonkers and signed like 2 messages, the penalty is very, very small. So it shouldn't like really affect like your consolidated validator.
But if I remember correctly, there's a technical distinction between like a penalty and a slashing, right? Like in other words, I suppose at a high level, the thought process is, look, some things can go awry accidentally. My node goes offline. I didn't intend it to, and you don't want to, be too punitive, and so that's kind of a penalty. But the slashing is supposed to be used for, something where you can sort of discernibly tell, like, I must have purposely done this. So, I think the easiest example that comes to my mind is double signing. And so you sort of alluded to that, I suppose, in the context of the 1/3 attack you were describing, and there you were talking about the whole sort of capital being slashed. But so for something like double signing, uh, you don't get all your capital slashed, right? And so part of what I'm wondering is, like, I'm sort of thinking about, penalizing at a, let's say, at a flat level versus penalizing proportionally.
Yeah.
And so, like, I seem to remember something like a 1 ETH penalty or 1 ETH slashing for maybe like something like a double signing. I may have the numbers wrong, but the point is, like, it was not anywhere close to like the total balance. And then
Yeah.
to Brad's point, if I now have 100 ETH in my there, then I mean, okay, 1 ETH is still a good amount of money, but still, you know what I mean. Like, if I make this very large, sort of 2,000 plus ETH, then 1 ETH seems like it's not really a good slashing cost for something that is like purposefully being done.
Yeah. Yeah, it goes a bit to like what slashing is for. So why do we
Incentives.
slash? Sure, sure, yeah, yeah. But which incentive? So I think they're kind of different. So you slash like the whole balance when you have like this 1/3 safety fault, and that's a way for the network to say, if we ever get a safety fault, there will be like all of this money burned, and so yeah, that makes like the promise kind of credible. But when you are like just a single guy making a mistake and your node double sign something and it's just like an isolated error, why slash then? I would say the incentive is probably at the time was probably set so that we try to tell people, security is important. Don't run 2 nodes with like the same key because you're going to do something stupid with that. So in a way, it's like raising the payoff almost, or raising the cost almost like artificially to
But wait,
make good incentives. Yeah.
just to clarify, so you described double signing as something that essentially could happen accidentally. So it's in the penalty category rather than in the slashing category.
Well, they're both slashing. So a penalty would be like my node is offline and I just like bleed
Right.
money.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, yeah. But when I double sign something, I get slashed, and I can be slashed as part of a larger attack, or I can be slashed as like an isolated incident. That's just my own fault.
Right. Okay. But I have always thought about double signing as like, okay, you must have purposefully done that. And now, what is the effect of it? If I remember correctly, that $20 million, Brad, some of your Brad did his undergrad at MIT, and so he may know the perpetrators of the attack I'm alluding to. But I believe that one involves double signing.
Low count Crusader. Yeah.
Yes, exactly, right. If I remember, like, if I remember
So
correctly, it was double.
that was okay. This is like very in the weeds. That was double signing, but it was not even double signing like the votes that could create a safety fault. Like it was double signing blocks,
Yeah,
which you could even say is like, yeah, why are we slashing people for that? But anyways,
because they can get
yeah,
$20 million.
sure. But then we slash them like $1,000, so it's not like so it's not so bad.
Yeah, yeah.
No.
Well, now you can slash 2048 ETH potentially. Uh, but anyway, okay. So I think that's a separate interesting discussion, which again maybe we can have at a future date. But maybe we can conclude with talking a little bit about the future here in the sense of well, I wanted to say Fusaka, but you've repeatedly made references to Glamsterdam, and you've also made the point that like there's like long-term planning, and some of it might be sort of more recent, owing to kind of some of the organizational changes that we discussed at the top. But so maybe let me ask it in a more open-ended way. Could you talk a little bit about Fusaka and or Amsterdam and or the path forward in terms of these upgrades?
Yeah. Yeah, I spoke about Amsterdam because it has like a bit more of these scaling VL1 features, but Fusaka is actually like a super, super important feature for scaling blobs, which is called peer DAS. So DAS stands for Data Availability Sampling. So in short, this should allow us to 8x the number of blobs that are currently provided by the network. So today we have this target of 6 blobs. With PeerDAS, we in theory can achieve 48 blobs target, so 8x the capacity of the current network, which is like almost an order of magnitude improvement over like the status quo, which is really significant. We can go briefly into how that works. Today, every node gets every blob in full. With PeerDAS, the idea is that we take a blob, split it into 8 pieces, and nodes only have to store 1/8 of the blob. And so that gives you like that 8x factor for the network as a whole to scale the number of blobs. And the network as a whole can be convinced that the blobs are indeed available because there's like these checks on the network for these parts of blobs, like making sure that everybody's convinced that the blobs actually exist and are available.
Could you actually just provide a little bit of more context on the, let's say, the constraints of doing that? Because, so first of all, like when you have only 1/8 of the blob, like, is this random or, basically like there's a statistical component to kind of what you're describing. And I'm kind of
Yeah.
curious to understand, first of all, there's even like, okay, so why now? What happened recently that suddenly this is, something you could do now? But I think it'll ultimately get into, maybe you could provide a little more detail on kind of how that 1/8 is selected. And then, for instance, if I'm going to challenge some state transition from a rollup, kind of the mechanics of how that would actually happen, given that each node only has 1/8.
Yeah, so the parts are gossiped on the network, so you can request any part that you want as long as it's available and the nodes will serve it to you. You have this feature of like erasure coding. That means that if you have like sufficient parts of the data that you want, like you can reconstruct it locally, and you don't need to like get especially like the unique parts of the blobs that you are like looking for. And so yeah, it's basically based on this. So like having networking that allows like the separation of these blobs and the dissemination of these parts of blobs, and then the erasure coding to reconstruct the data locally.
But was this feasible before? Like, why? What has changed that suddenly this is happening in this upgrade or in
Well,
Fusaka?
you need to implement it. So yeah, that's
Okay.
what changes. Yeah, and
Okay.
I think it's a little bit easier to say that yeah, your node locally can convince yourself that the full block is available if it has every part of the block. It's kind of a paradigm change to say that now you will vote on the availability of a block like without having seen it fully yourself. So yeah, it's just implementation, which is costly.
Okay.
Okay, Barnabé, last concluding question, even from a higher level. I've heard people say this, and I figured that you would probably be one of the best people to describe what they mean. What does it mean for the world to run on Ethereum?
Wow.
Right?
Okay.
I've heard this commonly, and I want to know, what does Ethereum thinking when they say this?
I see. I think it probably means different things. Let's see what it means for me. I think there are parts of the world's infrastructure, like servers and assets, that could be moved on an infrastructure like Ethereum, like where if I have my dollars in the bank, I can verify on the Ethereum Block Explorer that my bank is honestly attesting to the availability of these dollars. If I have stocks, I can send them around and compose them on applications that are deployed on Ethereum. Like if I have authentications like keys and stuff like this, like they can be stored on Ethereum and I can recover them like using Ethereum as like a tool. So yeah, moving more and more of this verifiability, composition of previously siloed applications with one another, and also I would say, yeah, authentication and identification of the actions. Like if that was all rooted on a single network that comes to like this global consensus, I think that could be helpful. And then we would have a world running on Ethereum, I suppose. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Okay, yeah. So as promised, that was the last question. So yeah, thank you so
Big
much,
question.
Barnabé, for joining the podcast today.
Thank you
It
too.
was great discussion. Yeah, I hope the whoever's listening can get some insight into the deep technical thought that goes on in Ethereum, and not just think about ETH is money, that type of thinking, and know that people are really trying to build something for the future. Yeah.
Thank you, Barnabé.
Thank you, Fahad. Thank you, Brad.